Now, originally I wanted to have this video done for May the 4th, thinking this be a perfect way to celebrate Star Wars Day, and I intended to do a full deep dive into A New Hope that was going to be part review, part analysis, part commentary, part random information, and finally part how does this movie stack up today, or what do I think would change if it was being made or remade today. Not that I think it ever should be remade or remastered ever again, mind you. But soon after I started to work on it, I realized doing what I wanted to do would result in a multiple hour-long video, so I scaled it way back in an effort to make it more focused and concise. That being said, if you'd be interested in me doing a long series of in-depth videos that would tackle each of the Star Wars movies in turn and the whole history of the franchise more or less, let me know in the comments below. All that being said, let me start this out with a bit of a confession. I don't really remember the first time I ever saw Star Wars, or as it's more commonly called today, A New Hope. I'm told that my first viewing was most likely in February of 1983 when I was 5 years old, and it aired on HBO for the very first time, but I only have the vaguest recollection of actually watching it. Mainly I just remember the excitement of my older brother and sister who already were and still are huge Star Wars fans. For whatever reason though, I do have very vivid and clear memories of watching Return of the Jedi for the first time a few short months later when it came out in May of 1983, and we went and saw it in a theater that is long since gone and torn down. And it's those memories that are a big reason why it's my personal favorite Star Wars movie, though I don't necessarily believe it to be the best of them. That honor instead goes to The Empire Strikes Back, it being one of those rare examples where a sequel is superior to the original, though I do think a very strong case could be made that A New Hope is actually the best Star Wars film, especially when you take into account the uphill battle George Lucas faced in just getting it made in the first place, because there had never been anything quite like it before, and nearly every studio turned him and his crazy idea down, a decision they'd all later regret. But before we get too deep into the behind-the-scenes story of how Star Wars came to be, which is certainly a great story for another time and one of those things I'm kind of cutting, let's dive right into the movie itself, starting with the now famous opening after the 20th Century Fox fanfare and the Lucasfilm logo, of course, that says, "A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away," which is a variation of Once Upon a Time, and lets us know that what we're about to see will have a sort of fairy tale feel or quality to it, that it will not be your standard science fiction film, but will instead be more of a space opera. And Lucas did want Star Wars to be something like a modern day myth, and one of his hopes was that the younger generation, of the time at least, might rediscover a sense of spirituality because of his film, and there are elements or principles taken from many different religions or philosophies in Star Wars, though we had no real intent of highlighting one in particular. Next then we get the giant yellow Star Wars logo, accompanied by some blaring horns which feels like it's trying to blast you back in your seat, like you're lifting off or it's preparing you for the adventure to come, before we then see our first ever opening crawl, which gives a very brief rundown or explanation about what's going on, which comes off feeling like a previously on Star Wars type thing, or like we're just being thrown right into the middle of a much bigger story. And this was very much intentional on the part of George Lucas, who again wanted to have this space opera feel to it, or something similar to the serial-style adventure shows he watched as a kid, like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. And even from the very first release of the movie, he wanted it to be called Episode 4, or to have it be present in the opening crawl at least. But the studio shut that idea down, figuring it'd be way too confusing to the audience. Anyway, as that opening crawl rolls by, telling us about a rebel alliance which has scored its first major victory against an evil galactic empire, and stolen the plans to something called the Death Star, John Williams is now famous the world over Star Wars themed plays. And though I won't be talking too much about the music in this video, let me quickly say that there's no way to overstate the importance of John Williams to Star Wars. I fully believe if not for his epic score, it would not have become as successful as it ultimately did. And I've joked before that I would love to see a cut of Star Wars that removed Williams' score and replaced it with the more traditional sci-fi soundtracks of the time, soundtracks that relied heavily on synthesizers and other futuristic sounds. And though Lucas, rightfully so, does get and deserve a good bulk of the credit for Star Wars, there are many, many others, John Williams among them, who deserves a great deal of credit as well. Star Wars was not just the work of one man, it was the work of many talented people on many different fronts, coming together to make a true masterpiece that has, and likely forever will, stand the test of time. But I digress. In keeping with that idea of being thrown right into the middle of everything, the very first shot we get is of the Tantive IV fleeing a massive Star Destroyer that flies right over our heads and just seems to go on forever. And this was the perfect way to, right at the start, show us just how outgunned and outmatched the Rebellion is compared to this evil empire. One thing Star Wars does oh so well is show us what's going on, not just tell us. Soon enough then we're taken aboard the Tantive 4, but we're not introduced to any of our main heroes or protagonists quite yet. Instead, we meet and follow R2-D2 and C-3PO, these two droids, for the first couple minutes of the film, intermixed with some scenes of the attack going on in the Tantive 4. And we'll continue to sort of follow their point of view for not only this movie, but for the whole trilogy even, which was very much intentional on Lucas's part. He wanted this story to be viewed through the innocuous eyes of someone who really didn't grasp what was going on and was just kind of being pulled along for the ride, much like the viewer likely felt the first time they watched this. And that's one of the things I think would be lost if someone tried to make this movie today, because very rarely, if ever, do today's big budget action films try to be or do anything outside of the norm. There's a reason why some will say that if you've seen one big summer blockbuster, you've seen them all. Most nowadays are just all about the spectacle, not about the presentation of it. The nuance of great storytelling is lost in modern-day films, especially the big action-packed blockbusters. And something else I think that might change if Star Wars was made today is our introduction to Darth Vader. As you know, in A New Hope, Stormtroopers burst through the door first and conduct the assault and takeover of the Tantive 4, and it's only when the battle is well in hand that Vader boards the ship. Nowadays, though, to quickly establish our villain as evil and powerful, I think Vader would lead the charge or lead the attack. He'd be the first one through that door, and it'd look like something like the scene in Rogue One where he's just cutting rebels apart at the end. In fact, though I think that's an awesome scene to behold, it almost ruins continuity just a bit, because after seeing that in Rogue One, seeing how aggressive and angry he was there, it's almost hard to believe he didn't lead the charge at the start of A New Hope. Anyway, roughly 6 minutes into the movie, we finally have a non-droid character speak, and that's when a stormtrooper tells Vader the plans are not in the main computer, which kicks off the interrogation of Captain Antilles, and you can certainly argue this scene is a much better and more subtle way of showing the ruthlessness of Darth Vader, over him kicking the door down and coming in with lightsaber blazing. It's also interesting to note that in the original trilogy at least, A New Hope is the only movie Darth Vader kills anyone besides his own men. It's amazing how a character can become perhaps the greatest film villain of all time, based largely off sheer on-screen presence and what our imaginations believe him capable of. Though yeah, his beatdown of Luke in The Empire Strikes Back was impressive to see, and certainly didn't hurt his status. Another thing I find interesting is that a lot of people I've talked to over the years believed that Stormtroopers were clones, even before the prequels came out, and seem to imply they very well could be. It's one of those things I think people just inferred based off a couple mysterious lines about the Clone Wars in this movie. Also in a film like Star Wars, where you're really focusing on the idea of good versus evil and not really wanting to expose the grayer aspects of such a conflict, which there inevitably are, like the fact that each stormtrooper is an individual who may be fighting for the Empire because they have no other choice or were conscripted. Well, you very much want your audience to see them as faceless drones, not as people, because your heroes are going to be thoughtlessly killing them throughout the film, which is why I was surprised when The Force Awakens introduced a character like Finn and tried to show us how they are people too, speaking of stormtroopers. But so far, I'm not so sure much has been done with that story point, and it's a topic for another video. And so moving on, soon enough we're introduced to one of our true heroes, Princess Leia. And no, I'm not going to call her one of the greatest strong female characters of all time. I'm just going to call her what she truly is. One of the greatest characters ever, period. And with her, Lucas didn't want the classic damsel in distress trope. He wanted a princess who could handle herself and even ultimately be a leader. And not that I want to delve too deeply into this topic here and now, but in my entire life, all these years of being a Star Wars fan, I have never once, not one single time, heard a fan complain about Princess Leia or say that they don't like her because she's a woman. So if there's any character that immediately and unequivocally disproves this ridiculous notion that male Star Wars fans can't handle strong female characters, it's Princess Leia, who on multiple different occasions here in this first movie goes toe-to-toe with Darth Vader and doesn't back down an inch from him. And no one has ever lodged one single complaint about that. Anyway, it isn't until about 17 minutes into the film that we finally meet our next hero, Luke Skywalker, and that's something else that might change if this film was instead being made today, how long it takes to get to Luke and how much time we spent with the droids roaming around and arguing in the desert. Anyway, Luke will be our main protagonist throughout this trilogy. He will be the one we go on the hero's journey with. And George Lucas was heavily inspired by the book The Hero of a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. In fact, it wasn't until he started to read that book and learn about the hero's journey that he finally found a real direction for the story and wrote a draft of the script that the studio approved. And of course, Luke Skywalker starts out as a whiny farm boy who wants to go join the academy and lead a life of excitement and adventure, but is stuck helping his aunt and uncle on their moisture farm. And though Leia is a break from the traditional princess trope, Luke is the classic hero archetype, one that's been done over and over again in many different stories and will be to the end of time, because when it's pulled off well, like it was with Luke, it can lead to some of the greatest, most endearing characters ever. And so Luke's hero journey, the first step of it, starts off with the call to adventure, which is when his uncle buys the droids R2 and 3PO, and Luke soon discovers that one of them carries a message from a desperate princess for someone called Obi-Wan Kenobi, who is her last hope. And a princess in distress is about as tried and true as it gets for a call to adventure. Luke, however, initially thinks the problems are all too far away and beyond his control, until R2 takes off in search of Obi-Wan, and Luke's forced to go off after him, and eventually gets jumped by some Tusken Raiders, and is ultimately saved by Obi-Wan. This then leads us to one of the few moments of true exposition in the movie, when Obi-Wan explains what the Force is to Luke. And that's the thing with this movie. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the first time you watch it, it feels like you're just going along for the ride, and it's not necessarily easy to grasp the bigger picture. Which again was also done intentionally by Lucas. He didn't want to waste time having the characters, indirectly of course, explain everything to us the audience. He wanted us to focus on the story itself, and to make it all feel as natural and as organic as possible. Like these were just normal people living in a galaxy that made complete sense to them, and we were just following along and observing it, like those two droids we first meet. And it's all pulled off amazingly well, and it's because these characters feel genuine, grounded, and real that we almost blindly accept the fantastic setting without the need to try and understand it all, even though that setting, as incredible as it oftentimes is, also manages to feel real and lived in and not completely foreign and unnatural to us, which further adds to the authenticity of everything, and helps us to just accept this without the need to have everything explained to us. And so again, Obi-Wan explaining the Force to Luke is one of those rare times when the movie is all but forced to, no pun intended, resort to almost pure exposition to explain something that we the audience actually does need a general understanding of. But thankfully, it does make sense in this situation because Luke also has no idea what the Force is. And this scene will also encompass two more steps in the hero's journey. Refusal of the call, when Luke basically tells Obi-Wan he can't save the galaxy with him because, he's got chores to do and all. And the other step is called supernatural aid, which is when Luke is told about the Force and that he can learn to use it. He's also presented with his father's lightsaber during the scene, which is more supernatural aid. Not to mention, while all of this is going on, a few quick seeds of motivation are planted in Luke when Obi-Wan talks about the man or monster who betrayed and murdered his father, seeds that won't take long to not only take root, but to grow within him. Because despite Luke's initial refusal to go with Obi-Wan to Alderaan to help safely deliver the plans, as is often the case with the hero's journey, he'll be thrust into adventure nonetheless. And after coming across an attacked Jawa sandcrawler, the one he and his uncle got the droids from, Luke realizes just how important these droids are to the Empire, that they're going to relentlessly track them anywhere and everywhere, and so he returns home to find the charred corpses of his aunt and uncle. And not to sound sadistic here, but this scene is great for so many reasons. First, as if butchering Jawas wasn't enough, we are bluntly shown the brutality of the Empire yet again when we focus upon those two smoldering corpses. We then have Luke, who initially looks away from the grisly scene, but forces himself to look back and remember this, all the while we get a slightly darker, sadder version of the Force theme. The same theme that played a bit earlier in the movie when Luke looked off into the horizon at the setting suns, with the expression of cautious yet somewhat dwindling hope or optimism that someday he'd escape this planet and find the life he wanted, the adventurous one he felt he was meant to lead. But now, with everything that he once cared for being taken from him, with everything that once held him back being gone, it's not a life of frivolous adventure he wants anymore. It's one of grim purpose that now beckons him, and with that brief 20-second scene, we're completely sold on what Luke will now do next. The motivation for him in this movie is simple, straightforward, and works unquestionably well. And so he goes back and tells Obi-Wan he wants to become a Jedi like his father, and thus he makes his first willing move towards a transformation that will one day see him indeed become a Jedi Knight. He's crossed the threshold. He's leaving the familiar behind for the unknown and in pursuit of something bigger than himself, which is the next step in the hero's journey, and we will quite literally see him enter the unfamiliar when he goes into the cantina in Mos Eisley, where this young man, this future hero, is now ready for his destiny, and is immediately humbled in what's essentially a bar fight, and needs Obi-Wan to come bail him out. But this moment also shows us that, though Obi-Wan says he used to be a Jedi Knight, and he's now just an old man, that doesn't mean he's helpless by any stretch. Another great part about this whole cantina sequence is the way it normalizes for us, the audience, the idea that aliens are not so much aliens in the Star Wars galaxy as they are just other species that populate it. And though at the time such a scene was mind-blowingly awesome to see, it was awesome to see all these different creatures just relaxing and having some drinks. Today, someone doing a scene like this would no doubt populate it with CGI aliens and creatures, and it'd lose all the grittiness and charm it had back then. But most importantly here, this is when we first meet Han Solo and Chewbacca, and I don't know if there's ever been an introduction in the history of film better than Han Solo's. From his shrewd negotiations with Obi-Wan, to the way he handles Greedo, shooting first, and then when he flips a coin to the bartender and apologizes for the mess before casually just walking out, everything we need to know about this character gets established not only quickly and efficiently, but it's done in the coolest way imaginable. And then after the arrangement with Han is made, Luke takes the next step in the hero's journey, known as Belly of the Whale, which represents leaving anything resembling his normal life behind, which happens when he gets aboard the Falcon and they blast off and leave Tatooine. Soon he undergoes his first bit of training, has a tiny victory over a training zone, and learns a little bit more about the Force, as do we. We also get to learn more about Han and how he supposedly believes in nothing and no one other than himself. And while all of this is happening, we're once again shown the ruthless nature of the Empire when they force Leia to give them the secret location of the Rebel base by threatening her home planet of Alderaan. And then when she gives it up, when she tells them where the base is, they destroy the planet anyway, as a type of warning or demonstration to the rest of the galaxy. Though Leia, of course, being no fool and having unwavering loyalty to the rebellion and their cause, also lied to them by giving them the location of a deserted base. And what this scene again does is allow Leia to show her strength while confronted by the likes of Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin at the same time, and that even with her planet on the line, she'll choose to defend the rebellion and believe in this fleeting hope that the Empire can be stopped one day. In my opinion, it is this scene that really defines Leia's character and the strength she possesses, and why she is the leader of the rebellion, or one of them at least. And not only that, but now we see just why the Empire so desperately needs to be stopped, why the Death Star is such a threat that needs to be destroyed if there is any hope for the galaxy. Again, this movie is so great at showing things, not just telling us. And it's at this point that any and all doubts about them being the bad guys were blown away, and we begin to truly realize what's at stake here. And that our heroes aboard the Falcon, who have R2 and the plans to the Death Star, just might be the only hope the galaxy has left. Which makes it all the more tension-filled when they, the last hopes in many different respects, find the Death Star instead of Alderaan upon coming out of hyperspace, and they're brought aboard it, but thanks to the cleverness of the smuggler Han Solo, they hide and avoid capture. And it's here, at about the midway point of this film, where the pace really begins to pick up, and the back half of this movie is one hell of an exciting ride. One that begins with the rescue of a princess, who then rescues her rescuers, which of course flies in the face of the normal damsel in distress trope. And this is one of the brilliant things about Star Wars. Yes, it's extremely formulaic at times, but it does diverge here and there in unexpected ways to keep you on your toes. Because who would expect the princess who had just been rescued to immediately take charge of the situation? But here's the thing, after the way she stood up for herself against Vader and Tarkin, her taking the helm here feels earned and not forced. We buy that Leia would be able to handle the situation, not to mention, more or less, handle the cocky, sure of himself Han Solo, who flat out tells her that he takes orders from only one person, himself, and she has that great comeback about it being a wonder that he's still alive. And it's these moments where we get to see this incredible chemistry between both these two characters and the actors who play them. We see that Han is able to get under Leia's skin, to be maybe the only weakness she really has, and that she's also able to basically do the same to him in return. And unfortunately for Luke, that chemistry between them was so magical that the idea of Luke ending up with Leia was scrapped and she ended up with Han instead. And mind you, originally Luke and Leia were not going to be twins or related in any way. Even in The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke flies away and Yoda says, "No, there is another," he wasn't talking about Leia. The original idea for Episode 6 was to introduce a new character that would be Luke's sister, but that was a bit much to pull off in one movie, so Leia was made his sister instead, thus explaining why in The Empire Strikes Back, that scene of Leia kissing Luke was in there, because at the time, it still hadn't been decided to make them siblings. But anyway, I'm talking about the wrong movie, and getting back to A New Hope, let's move on and talk about another scene that would almost undoubtedly be different if it were made today, or if it were remade, that being the duel between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader. Because though at the time it was pretty impressive just to see a fight between two guys with quote-unquote laser swords of all things, By today's standards, it would just be too slow. Not to mention, after now seeing Revenge of the Sith where they had their last encounter, some of the dialogue could and would be tweaked to be more in line with how that all went down. I mean, at one point after Vader says, "When I left you, I was but the learner, now I am the master," Obi-Wan responds by saying, "Only a master of evil, Darth." And it's weird or strange that Obi-Wan calls him Darth as if that's his name and not a title. I mean, likely that doesn't bug a lot of people, or they never really thought about it or noticed it until now. You're welcome. But it's just one of those things that sticks out to me and could be changed because, well, that's just me, I guess. As for Vader saying, "When I left you, I was but the learner," which doesn't seem to make sense since Anakin was far removed from being Obi-Wan's Padawan during their last encounter, well, that could actually be interpreted as Vader reminding Obi-Wan how they refused to make him a master when he was put on the council. Either way, again, if remade today, I think this scene would certainly be changed and the pace of the fight would be dramatically quickened. And it'd probably look a lot like the recently released video by Fixin' It in Post that you've likely seen, and if you haven't, I'll include a link to it in the description below, because it is awesome and absolutely worth checking out, or even watching again if you've already seen it. Anyway, the fight concludes with Obi-Wan seeing that Luke and his friends are about to get away, and I've always loved that little smirk on Obi-Wan's face at this point, as if all those years of watching over Luke has paid off, and that he knows that Vader has no idea what's truly coming for him next. And then Obi-Wan lets himself get struck down by Vader, or appear to be struck down, so that he can become one with the Force and continue on his journey. Though in all reality, Lucas decided to kill off Obi-Wan Kenobi here because he didn't know what else to do with him at this point, or for the rest of the movie, and he didn't want him just standing around during the Death Star attack. Plus, it made for a dramatic moment, I suppose, with Luke seeing his new master struck down by the same villain he thinks has murdered his father. And so, having run out of usefulness in this movie, Lucas just decided to kill off this character, and then when it came time to make The Empire Strikes Back, and Luke needed a teacher since the old one had been done away with, Yoda was created and was yet another sort of test for Luke, to see if he'd all but ignore or if he would interact with the proverbial insignificant creature or being that he came across on the side of the road. That actually turned out to be, of course, the all-powerful master. Another classic storytelling trope that Lucas inserted into his story. And speaking of that, all of this from Luke helping save Leia to him witnessing the death of his master and so on, it's all part of the next phase of the hero's journey, the road of trials. And as the name kind of implies, during this phase there will be highs and lows, victories and defeats, but it's all about learning and transforming into the hero he needs to be. And Luke will actually more or less go through this phase throughout the entire trilogy, but right in A New Hope he does complete, shall we say, a mini version of the hero's journey when he takes 2 more steps in this movie. The first being the Apotheosis, which is when the hero comes to a greater understanding of things or fully accepts his destiny and lets go of the old ways. And this takes place when Luke shuts off his targeting computer during the Death Star trench run and trusts in the Force, which allows him to achieve another step, which is called the Ultimate Boon, when the hero completes his quest or is victorious. And that occurs when Luke makes a 1 in a million shot and blows up the Death Star, thanks in large part to Han coming back to help him out, proving he's not all about the money. Okay, now in an effort to begin to wrap this up, since I did want this to be the short version, one could say that this movie was such a success and a cultural phenomena, and changed the course of film history because it not only did something no one else had ever considered even trying before, basically taking a space opera and blending it with a western and samurai movie and using the hero's journey as a template, but everything it tried, it got right. Sure, you could make some minor nitpicks here and there, and behind the scenes there were certainly problems, and in all reality, it's nothing short of a miracle that this ever got made in the first place and that it came out this damn good. But by and large, this was a perfect story that took place in a crazy setting that just worked and fascinated the audience and captured their imaginations and never let it go. And it was also a treat for the ears and featured one of the best scores in the history of film by the masterful John Williams, not to mention amazing sound effects by Ben Burtt that have become iconic on their own, like lightsabers, TIE fighter screeches, R2-D2's beeps and whistles, and so on. All in all, there were so many men and women both behind the camera and in front of it that, unknown to them at the time, were making history with this film. They were capturing lightning in a bottle, and it's unlikely that there will ever be anything quite like it again. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to share your memories of A New Hope. When was the first time you saw it? Or are you like me and you don't really recall and instead it's just always sort of been there? Either way, let me know in the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.